remote access to scientific equipment. Excellencies, most of you have received a call, several calls, in fact, to support this initiative. Basically, we help scientists in the Global South who don't have access to sophisticated equipment and technologies that they need to advance their research. We do the matching between their needs and between the available laboratories and equipment in the West. And we have already received a very generous response from many actually member states and from research institutes and the laboratories who are willing to share with us. And we are doing now the matching between the scientists' needs and these laboratories. And we expect that this will be a very important tool to help reducing brain drain in several regions and also strengthening the technologies and also enhancing the quality of research, which is very important. So in this initiative, we currently, so far, we trained about 126 researchers and 118 students benefited from this initiative in 5 African countries. Now we are expanding this to several regions, several countries, of course, and several regions. And with all your help, I think we can do more together. And as you can see, some of the, or at least one of the examples that can be advanced is data analysis and interpretation of significant contribution to publication, knowledge transfer, and so on. But the data analysis is very important in a field like disaster risk reduction, and building capacity, and this is, of course, very essential. Another activity we work on to empower scientists and engineers is linking science and engineering to entrepreneurship. The purpose of this series, this is a series of training boot camps that we conducted so far in several regions. And so far we had 4 boot camps. These are very intensive training courses, training activities. Targeting young researchers and engineers. And the purpose is to equip the scientists and the engineers with these skills to be able to take their innovative ideas from the lab to the market. There are great scientists and engineers around the world, and they just need the help to get trained on how to take their ideas out, how to use these great ideas to resolve challenges on the ground related to energy, to health, and of course to something like disaster risk reduction. So we conducted this actually in 3 continents so far. So far we trained 180 early scientists and engineers from 31 countries around the world. And in fact, usually the impact is the immediate impact at least, or the immediate feedback is very encouraging. In the first boot camp we conducted in Africa, at least two of the trainees got back to us and told us that they started establishing their startup companies based on the training they received. So this is for us very, very fulfilling. Another third example, so I focus only on these 3, but we have many other. I'll be happy to share with you more if you are interested, is the hands-on training related to the STEM. Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Our mission here is to increase the interest of young people in the field of science. Not only that we want everyone to be scientists and engineers, obviously not. There are many other fields people can be interested in. However, it is the idea of equipping them on the tools on how to think critically, how to judge, how to criticize, how to build more on what they learn. So this is really one important aspect we focus on our STEM training. And for this, we use simple tools, robotics, which are very simple to use, microscience kits. Again, this is as extracurricular. So far, more than 6, and we train the teachers because this helps us to train more students. So far, we trained more than 600 teachers and 5,000 students from actually more than 25 countries. So this is also one of our important initiatives. And this one, I wanted to end by this example of the STEM because, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's very much linked to scientific literacy and to the outreach. It's very important to start from the beginning, from the school level, And I mentioned scientific literacy because, as you all know, now we are within the International Decade of Sciences for Sustainable Development, which was proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly last August, and last year, August 2023. And it started this year, and we already, our strategic plan for the implementation of the decade was endorsed by the Executive Committee of the decade, which has representatives from all member states. And in this decade, or in this initiative, we want to use it as a transformative era to drive change and drive resilience and sustainability. So we consider it a very important initiative. The vision here is that sciences and a science culture required for a sustainable world are developed and accessible to all. And our mission is to engage all societal actors to further advance science and equally benefit from it. And we want really to build a culture of science. This is our ultimate goal at the end of the 10 years, to build a culture of science. Of course, there are many steps to take in order to reach this ultimate goal. However, when we say culture of science, it's very much linked to what I said about scientific literacy. We want to engage everyone. In one of the earlier presentations, it was mentioned clearly that the involvement of the general public, because they are the ones who actually get affected. We need to involve everyone in the society in these kind of initiatives, because they are the one who will benefit, so they have to contribute as well. They have to play a very important role that we hope to succeed to engage them during this initiative. And with this, I thank you very much.
Thank you for emphasizing the importance of capacity building and showing the interesting trainings your team is implementing. So thank you to all of our panelists for their insightful interventions. We've covered a lot of ground, and now I'd like to open the floor for questions. We don't have much time, but we can take some questions. So feel free to raise your hand or your nameplate, and for those joining online, use the chat feature to submit your questions. No questions from the floor? Yes.
Thank you, Sarah Schubert from the Institute for Civil Protection and Emergency Management. Knowing what you know now, how would you improve the contribution of science, technology and innovation into the Sendai framework if you were to travel back 15 years?
Who would like to tackle that question first?
Yeah, I think it was actually done pretty okay. I think in the Sendai framework, when I was part of the preparations of it too, and during also with several groups gathering scientists and scientific views to bring it in the framework. And I think it was pretty successful to mention science in the text of the framework, so it was recognized that it is important. And then, of course, afterwards, it's the implementation of things. And one thing that we did with the Joint Research Center together with the UNDRR, UNISDR back then still, was to organize a conference on science. And this was the first one. And then there were several other conferences before the global platform where this community comes together and discusses about that. I think that those were very useful events where there was a roadmap developed on where to go with the science. This roadmap has been revised so that there's a bit of coordination, regularly reflection on what are the key points that are important there. So I think it was quite good. Of course, the challenges are huge. Not everything is solved, but we see so much progress in different countries. New initiative coming up, early warning for all, really getting a top political emphasis and this. So I think the role of science remains super important, and we need to bridge the gap between science and policy, science and practitioners also through capacity building. So it's not a job done. but in this area, very important to continue.
Yes, please.
I guess once we were crafting those SDGs at 2015, probably we didn't have that much of clarity or in the confidence in the science at that level, where it can take us to the level of global interoperability. And we guess that it cannot be achieved without compatibility and without allocation of resources to avoid overlaps, duplications, and creating minimum redundancies in sectors. For example, we anticipate that there are capacities which are centered into developed world, and then if that intelligence is not shared in time for the people who are likely to be impacted in the future. So I guess unutilized information or science would also be a wastage of the resources and the time allocation to those content. While we are looking at global early warning systems for all goal by 2027, so let's see that what all we can achieve by in next 3 years, because only then the global response would be meaningful. Without that global achievement by 2027, I think we will be not be able to at least cross that benchmark of mid-course review after 2024, and whatever goals that we have now seen that we are decades of science by 2033, but should be celebrated then. Because this capacity of I think the science today or the artificial intelligence or machine capacity today is still not comprehensible at this with all or most of the development organizations which are dealing with these disasters. And I guess that the information needs to go further beyond, it needs to be scaled up and then made available to everyone, because this information, global early warning app, we suggested that it could be one standard global app which could be accessible to everyone and across the world, because if information housed in one part of the scientific research is not usable to the other centers, it will also mean a lot of loss. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the question. I want to add another layer on the discussion, and we have seen within the different interventions that the problem is complex. This is why we believe that we need more than ever science to help us to better understand those interlinkages vis-à-vis putting in place comprehensive solutions for building resilience. Why I'm saying this? Because the nature of the problem is that we shouldn't anymore work in silo, because it will not help us to reap out all the benefit of the integration. This is why, from our perspective, we are really encouraging to move towards the interdisciplinary, towards transdisciplinary science approach. And for example, within our intergovernmental hydrological program, this really is the approach we are promoting. How we can harness social, environmental, physical, economic, scientific aspect in advancing the knowledge for evidence-based decision making. And even when it's come to the early warning system, now we have the multi-hazard early warning system, but we can even build on impactful early warning related to impact. For example, if you want to have to know an estimate of potential impact, of course, one of the key challenges is the data, because I think many of us highlighted the data. If you have good data, even the early warning system will help us to estimate the potential impact moving forward. So there's a lot of work to be done, but really the message is we need more than ever science to help us advance addressing these complex challenges. But more importantly, we need to have interdisciplinary and towards transdisciplinary science.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Okay. We have a question online. So, do the panelists think disaster risk communication and disaster risk communicators should be involved and increased more to drive disaster risk reduction ahead?
Risk communication is very important, but As we discussed, responding to the first question, we have to address what we have never experienced. So that's why cutting-edge science needs by deepening the science, basic science, but that should be shared with community. So that component we have not developed yet. And also, as Abu mentioned, in the last century, especially last century, our science has been deepening and narrowing our target to get a better answer. But nowadays, we need to change the direction and integrating and synthesizing this through the interdisciplinary framework. So this is also very important, the effort to be taken, to be made by science community, and the information, the knowledge should be shared with the community.
I'd just like to add a couple of points because disaster risk communication is a little tricky business nowadays. Once we pass on this information to the people who are likely to be responders or likely to be affected, and if it is far into the future, like 6 months from today, people would be less interested to at least conform or adapt and relocate. Last year, we experienced such like scenarios where we anticipated excessive river flows in some of the areas which had never seen those flows in the last 30 years, but we calculated and saw there was prospect of the river floodings. So people struggled to adapt to that information, but we then made it sure that people got relocated, and over 1.5 million people were moved from various areas which were then flooded out of the archived informations on their memories about the disasters. So it is very challenging for the community to absorb the risk of communication if it is told out of the blue and it is out of the proportions, which has not been there in the memories of these communities or the areas. It is important then to us to have the experts on risk communication, which would come from not only the media background or the IT background, but they should also have multi-skills of having the knowledge about the disaster that they are reporting. Because whatever we communicate in the various mediums, electronic, print, digital, or social media, has to be qualified by certain scientific research basis and credible intelligence, which is to be verified in the data. And obviously, with the passage of time, this risk communication would pass on from not only the places of the, I would say, IT centers like ours, it will also go to the places of the remote areas where people are looking forward to have access to this information passed on from the places of even worships like mosques and churches. People get together and we pass on the message to the community elder, and he takes the message to the tribe or the clan and the people in the remote mountainous areas. So this risk communication is to take form into mobile applications, to the verbal messages, to the academia debate, and then to a natural community debate. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. I totally agree with what, can you hear me? Okay. I agree with this, what you mentioned now, and I think it's very much related also to misinformation and disinformation that we really need to fight really heavily. And also about simplifying science. As you said, most of the scientists live perhaps in their own world. So it's actually a joint role between the scientists, the governments, and also the international organizations. We need really to join forces in order to find the platforms to simplify the facts and simplify science, make it easier for everyone to understand what is behind the science. It's not so complex, it can be understood, and if they understand, I am sure they will respond. And then this is when the communication will not be a risk. In fact, it will be an aid factor to help people to survive in disaster. So it's all about communication and how to communicate science in a very simplified way. Thank you.
Yeah, if I can add to what just Amal said, indeed, yeah, the issue of simplifying and better communicating is critical. During my presentation, I was alluding to the community early warning system. Because if we are conveying the message for people to act, if they don't understand that message, you will not act. And when it comes to community, generally we need to have very simple things. And I think we have good examples where, for example, you indicated the level of the water, you can have a color code and indicating if the level is at this level, this red, you have to do this and then. But most importantly also is on the risk itself. What is the perception of risk by people, by community? I think this is also another issue, another place where we need to educate, to change the culture. For example, a simple example, among the technical people, when there is a flood, we are giving what you call a return period. We say, this flood is 100-year flood. But many people don't understand what it means. Because I had an experience where there was an infrastructure which was destroyed by an event. And then the mayor of the city was saying, no, but what happened? The engineer told us the return period is 25 years. Why we are destroyed now? So the understanding is that we need maybe to put it another way. It's not to mean that because it's designed for 25 years, we need to have to wait 25 years to have an event. That event have a chance of 120 to occur every year. That's what it means. So even the way we are communicating the information, we need also to frame it so that everybody can better understand. Because sometimes it's creating confusion to those who are supposed to use the knowledge to take decision.
Perhaps another contribution to this very interesting debate. Communication is so important. And yes, science is not about knowing the truth, but it's about telling this to people so they act in the right way, you know. And perhaps rather of talking about disasters themselves, but about risk management in the future and climate change and all. I always say things like this has been the worst year in the world forever on temperature or on droughts or on floods or something. So always a negative message. And this is a bit what we always try to do. No? The worse it is, the more people will act. But it's not like that. In the end, the narrative has to be a narrative of possibilities and of agency, and so that you tell the story in a way that people in their small world of my house and my neighbor are able to take action to reduce the risk there. And maybe we are doing this too less, not enough. You know, from the scientific point of view, we say this is the truth, but it doesn't matter. You have to tell the story in a way that everyone, in a perhaps not simple way, but a way that people know what they can do in the big story, you know. And I think there's a lot of work to do there, the cognitive sciences of decision making that we collectively have to do.
Just very short, because I know we run over time. I think it is also communications channels are extremely important. So the way that we contribute or try to convey the message to which channels is very specific. So sometimes it can be radio. I know there's in Germany there was an example of the authorities trying to launch an app which then didn't work for most of the population, and the warnings didn't come through, so they went back and they actually deconstructed the sirens, all the noise that you can hear, and then they actually went back to now implement cell broadcast, which just sends a simple message to your phone. So sophistication, I think that is also not always the best choice. It's sometimes simplicity in the approach. That's one, and I think the second is there is no glory in prevention sometimes. So politicians will often be risk averse in really following through with also amplifying the warning for the fear of not being sometimes taken seriously, or basically when the event does not occur, then future warnings may not be as impactful anymore. And I think that's also a very big challenge in the communication, but I think this is all can be done through capacity building, through selection of the right channels, through constant monitoring. So yeah, I think the person who doesn't think that communication is an integral part of disaster risk reduction, I don't think, that's the case. It's a very integral part.
Thank you to all of the panelists. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to take more questions. Okay. Okay, one more question.
Thank you. It's been a very interesting morning, a lot of learnings and very rich discussions. I just have a question because I haven't really heard very much about informal settlements, because that tends to be where a lot of the disasters hit hardest. And I just wanted to know these informal settlements tend to be places where there are the least resources, they're very heavily congested. And so what exactly is in place in terms of contingency? How do you manage the disaster in those settlements? Because I haven't really heard very much in terms of how disaster is managed in those types of communities. Thank you.
Once we are talking about the areas of the settlements or the infrastructure, which is of different configurations, we have found out that it all starts from the audit of the affected areas up front. We have been through lots of these examples, and we have found out that unless we have a clear categorizations of all those who are being impacted by the next disasters, we cannot have a resilient plan for the earlier recovery or the maybe resilient recovery of that. In case of settlements and the people, and once we're looking at the informal and formal areas, we had to find out that what all can be saved by retrofitting, what all we can save by relocations, and what all can be saved by entire new models of the developments of these templates for reconstruction and rebuild. There were different models which were tested in different models of disaster management, and we found that one of the areas was to find the help of the not only the existing cultural choices, but community requirements, and then the entire response has to be based on the detailed audit first, and then the response allocations in the later stages. Thank you.
Okay. So I think now we have to close the session, but thank you all very, very much. This has been an interesting discussion, and it's only one of four on today's program. So after lunch, we'll hear from experts to discuss on the built environment. Later, we'll discuss the interlinkages between culture, nature-based solutions, and indigenous knowledge systems. And later, we'll delve into the economics of disaster risk reduction. So now we break for lunch. My colleague has come around to give everyone their lunch vouchers. So please return to the room about 1:25 so we can start right on time. So thank you and bon appetit. And a round of applause for all of our panelists. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us in the room or connected online. Welcome to the second session. My name is America Bendito, and I am honored to chair this session addressing vulnerabilities in the built environment, challenges and solutions. We will have presentations followed by question and answers, and I encourage you both in person and virtual participants to ask questions. As this is a hybrid session, we will try to balance the in-room discussions with the virtual contributions. Please feel free to engage fully regardless of where you are. We have the privilege to hear from 5 qualified panelists who will be sharing their valuable insights today. I now invite them to join me in the podium. Dina de Ayala, Ana Redondo, Sabine Cast, Mafira Abida, and Soichiro Yasukawa. It is crucial that we set a clear path through a resilient built environment as a vital piece of a wider effort to create a resilient society. Our strategy must be holistic, addressing both mitigation and adaptation. Importantly, adaptation should not only focus on reducing the vulnerability of buildings, but should also integrate local wisdom and the natural construction in faulted settlements and the understanding of the root causes of risk from the social, cultural, and political processes that ultimately result in vulnerability and exposure. We must recognize that natural hazards disproportionately affect the most vulnerable communities, and this reality must be systemically integrated into our planning and action. Equally important is the need to ensure that the voices of those impacted are included in decision-making processes. Only by doing so, we can ensure that the cost and benefits of adaptations and mitigation are fairly distributed across all sectors of society. In this session, we will explore key aspects critical to achieving resilient buildings. Dina Dayala, professor of structural engineer at University College London, will start this discussion presenting the crucial interaction of the Sendai framework and the Sustainable Development Goals, with emphasis on Goal 9, 11, and 13. As the UNESCO Chair in Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilient Engineering, she will share insights into the work towards the Sendai targets, highlighting on the importance of school infrastructure resilience. Dina will also introduce the glossy tools developed to enhance the resilience of school infrastructure and demonstrate how advanced technology can be used to assess disruptions in education services followed by natural hazards. Presenting a case study from Dominican Republic developed in the framework of Berlac project. Dina, the floor is yours.
Good. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much, everybody, and I assume the presentation will come shortly. Thank you very much for to the DRR unit to invite me to open this second session of this very important conference on resilience of built environment. Specifically, as America said, I will delve into the use of advanced technology to improve infrastructure resilience. If I can have the presentation. Yeah. Yeah. Can you hear me better? Yes. So you're probably all familiar with the Sendai framework targets, but I particularly want to draw your attentions to target D, which aims to reduce damage to infrastructures, and to target E, that aims to increase the number of countries taking on disaster risk reduction strategies, which are both very relevant to this session. These targets are further delineated and articulated into sub-targets, and in particularly E1 and E2 look at how we define disaster risk reduction strategy at national level, and then we identify the chain of responsibility that allows to implement this at local level. On the other end, as you can see from D3 there, the emphasis is specifically on reducing the number of damaged and destroyed school infrastructures, and this is what we will look more into this afternoon. In meeting these targets and achieving these targets, we will certainly be able to address some of the fundamental sustainable development goals. I don't have time now to delve into how we improve each of them, but this is just for reference. So What progress are we making in meeting these targets? As UNESCO chair in disaster risk reduction and resilience engineering, we have partnered with the UNESCO DRR unit and the presidency of the Dominican Republic, for instance, to support programs for school infrastructure resilience at national and subnational level. We have also engaged locally through the Lloyd's program IPUR, the Institute for Public Understanding of Risk, to work in the Philippines with the community in Cagayan de Oro to build capacity and to understand better the dynamic of decision-making at local level, building affordable and accessible decision support tools directly with the end users. These activities are developed by development of tools and models that allow us to then focus on how we can reduce damage and we can improve resilience. But when we consider schools, again, there is an issue of scale here. And at global level, we have things such as the Global Program for Safer School, developed, led by the World Bank, or the Comprehensive School Safety Framework, led by GADRES, which give us an overview and targets that nations should address and should look forwards. However, when we look at implementation at local level, we need to start taking the scale of the individual school, and within the individual school that is already in existence and being used, at the level of the individual buildings, its specific vulnerability and its potential for retrofitting and improvement in order to make it safe. We can certainly build safer schools for the future, but the schools very often are already there, and we need to therefore think of how we invest in making safe the infrastructures that we already have, which is certainly more sustainable. So what is it that we can prioritize? Likely, schools are fairly standard through nation and across nation because of the unique functions that they recall. So through the Global Library for School Infrastructures, again in collaboration with the World Bank, we have built first of all a taxonomy that identifies the parameters in schools that are relevant, in this case, to earthquake risk, damage and risk, but also now we are developing a glossy tool for wind and flooding. Once we have identified this taxonomy, we can scan quickly a large number of buildings in a particular location to identify typology. We can then use our engineering understanding of vulnerability, fragility, and risk in order to determine what are the issues with this building topology at scale and determine the effect on that intervention can have in reducing that vulnerability. That can be scaled up from the individual school at this point, or the individual buildings, to building stock and to a repository of buildings that then government can make decision on where to invest in relation to their economic environment. Naturally, when we look at an earthquake or a flood causing havoc in a particular area, we cannot just, again, think about one school. We need to think, the government needs to think about all the elements that have been failed, but also at all the connections between the schools if we want to then go back quickly to access back these schools and put them back in use for students and staff alike. So how can we facilitate that process of recovery? We have used advanced statistics and computational tools to define, through Bayesian network, for instance, to define the relationship between physical damage and social vulnerability of a particular community, to understand whether schools will be used can be used for schooling or will be used for shelters, and therefore understand what is the operability of that school, what is their operational behavior. This allows us to, because of the use of probabilistic tools, to define a large number of probability from which we use Monte Carlo simulations in order to simulate thousands and thousands of different instances that we can then interrogate with agent-based model, assuming very different recovering strategies, for instance, in order to understand first whether the individual school, but also the overall school infrastructure is resilient, and how quick it will take to recover the educational services, but also we can then input at this stage the possible strengthening plans that a government has formulating, retrofitting plans, so that we can then look at what would be, go back, oops. Sorry, what would be the let's say, scenarios if this investment were indeed made. So what does that mean? I will illustrate this, as America said, with relation to examples in the province of San Pedro de Macorís in the Dominican Republic, where a very complex situation is, of course, relatively simplified by considering we have detailed information on each school in the province, but we are going to aggregate this at the level of the municipality in order to have a scale at which we can consider different issues, and in particular, also to appreciate the social vulnerability of the different municipalities, making reference to the census in the year. So with reference to this, we can then consider, as I said earlier, different recovery strategies. And here we are back about what do we prioritize. Do we prioritize repair and recovery in municipalities that have large number of students out of school, or do we prioritize the schools that are more damaged? This gives us different recovery lines, as you can see from there. I don't know, it doesn't work, the pointer. But basically, you can see that we can reduce the number of total days to recovery from about 240 to less than 200, depending on the strategies that we take, not just for recovering the schools, but also for recovering the road network that serves them. If we then consider also, as I said, the possibility of implementing, strengthening, retrofitting strategies, both again for the school infrastructures, but also very important from the road infrastructures and for the bridges, then we can see that we have, again, different traces here, and we can further reduce the number of days, we can further reduce the number of days by another 20%, more or less. So what does tell us? At this point, we can start considering what is the benefit of this investment, for instance, but also of different, again, investment strategy. Are we retrofitting only schools? Are we retrofitting only bridges? It seems that bridges have the best performance here. To a certain extent, we spend little money and we save quite a number of days. But we wouldn't save the same amount of days, as we can see from the traces, as if we consider both strategies. And how do we quantify this benefit in a way that is communicatable and relatable to the public, but also to the stakeholders. We have there a very simple measure, the cost per individual student per day saved to education. This is not less than $7 per student per day, comparable, easy comparable for any family with the amount of money that is spent on food or the amount of money that is spent on transport to go to school and to eat while you are there. So again, it's a scale at which everybody can think about. We can do the same for floods, and we have indeed apparently an even bigger saving in terms of days, but we find out that this is more costly in terms of that particular metric that we are using, although the investment is similar. And this is because the flood is more localized, we ended up with less number of students benefiting from that particular event. But that doesn't mean that should be less of a priority, especially if we think that floods are more common than earthquake. Hence, over the same time horizon, we would have had 5 floods for any individual earthquake that you might get, given the return period. I think somebody earlier on was talking about return period this morning, and therefore that means that the investment in flood might actually be more beneficial than the investment in earthquake resistance. I'm just concluding here because I think we don't have much time, but I just want to highlight some points for discussion. Data, data, data. We have been speaking about AI earlier. AI is wonderful, but we need to be very careful about what we put in it, who use it, and how it is interpreted. So we need to be, there are this global repository that we can use. For me, the best things that is happening is that with increased IT literacy, the type of model that I've just developed can be very easily taught locally, and people can take it on and can develop it with the local knowledge. In this ambit, I think that UNESCO have a pivotal role in making this happen. And then the other one is communication. I've already mentioned the metrics, so I will not go on to it. These type of platforms are very useful, not so much from an academic point of view. It might not even be, the top of the development at the moment, but are very useful because local government or national government can use them to start having conversation and to start thinking large number of what-ifs that can be assessed in relatively little time. But of course, the interpretation of the results is very important, and we need to be careful on what we learn from them. And the other very important thing is the social vulnerability. Clearly, we can strengthen schools, we can improve the school infrastructures and the road infrastructure if the homes of the people are not also safe. In a poor community, once they are struck by an hazard, then they will go to the school to use it as shelter, and therefore it will not be used for education purposes. And with this, I close my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dina.
Sorry if I've done.
Building on Dina's case study in Dominican Republic, we will now hear from Ana Arrendo Eve, head of the Risk Management Department at the National Office for Seismic Evaluation and Vulnerability of Public and Private Infrastructure and Buildings, ONESBI. Ana will provide a deeper dive into policies and financing for school safety in Dominican Republic. She will also highlight the success of VERLAB project, which has enhanced the resilience and safety of schools infrastructure. Her insights will offer valuable lessons for the education sector and beyond. Ana, I now invite you to share your thoughts.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and esteemed panelists. It's an honor for me to be here representing my country, Dominican Republic, and the National Office of Seismic Evaluation, Vulnerability of Infrastructure and Buildings on ESBI, and its General Director, the engineer Leonardo Reyes Madera. Today we meet to talk about the vision of the Dominican Republic and UNESCO regarding school safety regulations and financing. This shared approach with UNESCO gave rise to the VERLAC project. Perdón, ay, se pasó rápido. Se fue. Okay, now. Okay. Now, yes. Okay. The Dominican state is committed to improving the quality, inclusion, and universal access to education through the implementation of policy, laws, teacher training programs, and improvements in school infrastructure. As you can see, in terms of laws, we are quite robust. UNESB's role is to assess and reduce the seismic vulnerability of schools' infrastructure. In 2022, the government invests 19.03% of the national budget in all matters related to education. May I say that UNESCO noted significant investment progress in the Dominican Republic, but warns that low level of quality persists. May I mention that we have deficit school infrastructure, high dropout of schools, and others. Okay. The Dominican state is committed to improving the quality, inclusion, and universal access to education. I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong time. Okay. In the Dominican Republic, most school funding is controlled by the Ministry of Education, which handles purchase for school. A small portion, 6%, is managed locally by regional and district board for things like teaching support, maintenance, and administration. These funds are based on the numbers of students. Okay. The Inter-American Development Bank has a tool called EGOP, which measures the governance and public policy index for disaster risk management. According to this tool, the Dominican Republic shows an overall level of progress that is still incipient, with a compliance rate of 27.59%. I may say the study was conducted in 2013. Okay, the VERLAC project aims to assist, earthquake-prone countries in improving the safety of their building through the creation of risk-based policies, the strengthening of local construction sector capacity, and raising awareness of seismic risk. This project has 4 components. In 2 of them, the Dominican Republic is involved. Component 2 and Component 4. Component 2 is focused on the safety of school facility, implementing visions and using AI, and Component 4, which deals with the development of risk policies. Okay, I don't know why this is not working well. Okay. Now, we have method number 2, that is vicious. Vicious methodology provides policymakers with a quick and cost-effective assessment of risk in school facility, offering scientific data to make decisions and prioritize improvement in school safety. In the Dominican Republic, this methodology assists 85 educational institutions, revealing the following results. As you can see, I may mention 4 of the schools in appropriate locations, 39 schools, structural building do not ensure structural stabilities. 5 of the schools, the life safe, there are no critical issues, and others. Okay, the Dominican Republic is in an active seismic zone and in a path of the hurricane. On the map, the tectonic faults are shaded in gray. Green dots mark the location of all public schools in the country, and the blue indicators shows where the vicious program inspected 85 schools. 35 of which are located in the fault line. To mitigate the risk, UNESCO studied recommendation used of a reinforced concrete wall to enhance the earthquake resistance of schools. The use of AI to minimize educational disruption after natural hazard, case of study San Pedro de Macorís. Integrated methodologies were used to model education services disruption, Bayesian network, Monte Carlo simulation, and the age-based model AB. You can see the two models, and one of them, San Pedro de Macorís, rural area, grapho, marks the blue dots are the school, the rectangle, the red rectangle are the bridges, and the green line is how they connect or how they communicate. The analysis of the result, multi-treat assessment, it was made by 288 schools. In a seismic scenario, without an intervention, we will have 206 days of interruption. Reinforcing both bridges and school, we only are going to have 173 days of interruption. The investment per day per student can be up to $6.60. In a fluid scenario, 0.25 meter fluid deep, without an intervention, we're going to have 127 days of interruption, and a straightening school, only 69 days of interruption. The investment cost per student can be up to $2.80. Okay, this is component 4. And let me see. Oh, God. Okay. In construction, owners, contractor, designer, and authority must adhere to standards to ensure quality and safety. Negligence can jeopardize the project and put users at risk. In the Dominican Republic, informal construction remains high despite regulations. Okay. Recommendations to improve the built environment are: number 1, own the position; 2, encourage own the position; 3, pressure from others, stakeholders to follow regulation; and number 4, regulation by authorities. These are the words from our General Director, Leonardo Reyes Madera, and I'm going to make a little resume of that, in which I marked that in meeting with the Vice Minister of the Ministry of the Presidency, representative of UNESCO and UNESCO, the results of the Verlac project were presented, which were very well received. From this meeting arose the initiative to develop a joint work plan to extend the project to all provinces nationwide, a crucial measure for the protection of life, one of the greatest benefits of the project. With Verlac project, we have taken a big step. In the 3 years of execution, it has proven to be effective and agile in collecting information and proposing precise solutions to improve educational quality. And we are currently in discussion to begin a second phase of this important work. So I want to say thank you to UNESCO for inviting me, and the support that my embassy, the Dominican Republic, is giving me today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ana. Next, we will hear from Sabine Cast, Director of International Programs at Miyamoto International. She will share her holistic perspective from their work in Afghanistan, focusing on cultural preservation and the natural construction as a vital component of resilience. Sabine, we are excited to hear your insights.
Thank you. Good day. On the topic of resilient built environments, I'll be sharing with you insights from the 2022 worst Afghanistan earthquake, and specifically discuss the housing infrastructure with you. Disaster experience shows that housing, the recovery of lost housing, is the most costliest aspect of recovery. The Afghanistan earthquake took place in the southeastern tip of the country, really near the Pakistani border. About 1,000 people died, 6,000 injuries, and about 15,000 houses were damaged and destroyed, rendering about 100,000 people homeless. The humanitarian community mobilized very rapidly to provide support, and because of the harsh winters and winter fast approaching, housing became a priority. About a year after the earthquake, Miyamoto conducted an evaluation of the housing recovery programs that were implemented in the aftermath of the disaster. We built a comprehensive framework that encompassed multiple dimensions, including technical, social, economic, environmental, and project planning and management, to evaluate the programs. There currently exists no widely accepted metrics of success for housing recovery. And we know that both in practice and in academia, and we know that, counting the number of houses that were rebuilt after disaster and the speed by which that is achieved is not a good enough metric for success. So from studying dozens of disaster cases and hundreds of journal papers and the literature, we identified the critical success factors that govern housing recovery success. We summarized these into key performance indicators, KPIs, that fall under these sort of broader categories seen up here, or broader dimensions that are seen up here on the screen. There were two distinct housing recovery approaches that were implemented in the aftermath of the Afghanistan earthquake. A vernacular approach that was primarily implemented through an owner-driven approach to reconstruction, meaning households were provided cash to lead the reconstruction of their homes. And then the other approach, and then using locally available materials in this region, specifically clay. The other approach was a non-vernacular approach. That approach relied on a prototype housing design that was designed using concrete and steel, and relied on a contractor-driven approach to reconstruction. We use the evaluation framework to, one, assess each approach, and then also compare the approaches. As you can see here, we used a method called the analytical hierarchy process to be able to more objectively quantify, score, and then quantify the outcomes or the successes of each program. And as you can see here, using this evaluation framework, we can clearly identify the strengths and weaknesses of each approach according to these dimensions. So let's take a look at the results for the vernacular and the non-vernacular approach. So surprisingly, the vernacular approach did score substantially higher than the non-vernacular approach. Why? Here's the biggest discrepancy in economics. The non-vernacular houses, the concrete and steel housing prototype, cost about $6,000, while the vernacular approach, the clay houses, cost about $1,500. That means for one concrete home, you can build 3 clay homes. This was particularly problematic as well in this disaster because at the time of the evaluation, there was a funding gap, which meant that about 2,000 households did not receive and did not receive financial housing assistance. And at that point, it was very unclear and very unlikely that more humanitarian aid would be allocated, which means that about 2,000 families would go without housing assistance, making them the clear losers of this disaster. Technically, the vernacular approach also scored substantially higher than the non-vernacular approach. And this is, again, a little bit of a surprising outcome, given that the concrete homes have much higher seismic capacity, meaning that they are, more robust construction and therefore safer. It was also the primary reason a lot of the aid agencies did choose the non-vernacular approach. However, analyzing the construction quality, there were considerable construction defects that resulted in the non-vernacular, the concrete homes. This is because this building material was not used and not common in that area. Contractors built these houses very, very rapidly without the engagement of households. We saw a lot of defects in windows and doors. And also the concrete houses were not very climatically appropriate, resulting in leakages, etc. With the non-vernacular approach, we saw much higher and much better quality. The likelihood of this is that the vernacular approach was accompanied by a very robust training capacity building program where homeowners and masons and the local builders were trained in better construction practices using vernacular that addressed the vulnerabilities that led to the damages and the destruction and the earthquake. And with this renewed knowledge, the quality of the houses were really good. It also indicates that if communities or if households are directly engaged in the construction of their houses, that they do take greater care. It is their home after all. And we definitely saw that in the quality of the construction. Socially, also a much higher score for the vernacular versus the non-vernacular, and we'll get to dive into that a little bit in more detail. Before doing so, here are some images of the construction. As you see here, there's a compound wall that is built out of clay. So after the disaster, an extensive damage assessment was conducted. An extensive damage assessment was conducted to identify the reasons why there was such high level of damage in the vernacular construction practices. Numerous sort of vulnerabilities in the built environment, in the housing construction were identified that resulted into the damage. What was observed is that there were vernacular houses, like very, very, very high compound walls that performed very well in the earthquake. And what was found is that there are indigenous practices to constructing with clay that had a very high seismic capacity, that were technically very, very sound. There was, of course, a lot of introduction of practices that didn't follow that indigenous knowledge in more recent years that caused that great vulnerability. And so the analysis found that one, clay construction does have high seismic capacity. Two, that there are good practices and bad practices, and if proper good construction practices were followed with the vernacular, that they could perform very well in earthquakes. This analysis also included material testing. Clay was tested, the properties of the clay and the local construction materials were tested to see whether or not they resulted in the damage, and it was found that these materials actually were pretty suitable for seismic construction. The key vulnerabilities, my CEO here, Dr. Kip Miyamoto, calls it the bad apple theory. When you look at the built environment, not everything is bad. There are always the devil really does lie in the details. And there are these sort of key vulnerabilities that drive destruction. And as you can see here, with vernacular construction, there were about only 6 practices that, if done properly, would result in much stronger housing, or would have led to the non-collapse of buildings. One, for example, is there was a practice that before the winters arrived, more clay would be stacked on the roofs to ensure that, and to prevent leakages. Of course, that over the years became very, very heavy. It's called a heavy seismic load that led to the collapse of the buildings. A maintenance practice that was traditionally practiced and that we trained on included scraping off the layers of clay before adding an extra layer, and therefore not creating such weight on the building. The other vulnerabilities are equally simple to address. As noted, there was a huge interest and a huge retention amongst the local population for training. And also, there was a lot of pride in receiving this training. As you can see, homeowners, this was quite widely observed, that homeowners or the occupants would post the 6 key messages very proudly on their houses. Here's an image that kind of contrasts the concrete homes that were newly constructed versus at the back you see an old complex or compound, Afghan compound. When we arrived at the site to evaluate the housing recovery approaches, we were shocked by the low levels of occupancy in both the vernacular and non-vernacular. We found women and children that were living pretty far away from the housing units that were constructed, hiding in mountains, and under sort of living in bunkers that they had dug themselves. The reason for this is that in Afghanistan, similar to other neighboring countries, the home is not a housing unit, it is really the compound where extended families live. And so the parameters or the parameters of a house are defined by the compound wall. For the concrete construction to take place, the compound walls, if they were intact or damaged by the earthquake, were demolished to get equipment onto the land to build the houses. While with the vernacular approach, the rebuilding of the compound walls was not necessarily specified in the recovery programs. Humanitarian aid organizations and their donors were looking at housing units specifically and didn't sort of permit or incorporate the rebuilding of compound walls. However, because families were provided cash to rebuild their homes and materials were oftentimes locally sourced and labor was used usually within the household, that extra additional funding could be used for the reconstruction of compound walls. And this resulted in a shockingly low level of occupancy in the concrete homes versus the non-vernacular homes, and therefore, amongst other social factors, the vernacular approach scored higher than the non-vernacular. So what do these lessons, how do we transfer these lessons? So here's some images of the compound walls. What are the transferable lessons? I think that the case study in Afghanistan is packed with lessons and insights, but primarily, I'll just sort of summarize a few. One is speed. There's always a tension between speed and deliberation. It was also seen here in this earthquake response, and the non-vernacular, the concrete housing construction, was preferred by humanitarian agencies and donors because the prototype had already been designed, it had already been implemented in other parts of the country, and it was seen as a solution that could be implemented more rapidly. Versus the vernacular approach where studies needed to still be conducted, the engineering analysis needed to be conducted, the training programs needed to be designed, the sort of proper construction guidelines, housing construction guidelines still needed to be developed. And so that's the reason why this sort of the introduction of a foreign prototype was first introduced. And I think this case clearly warns against that approach. Introducing new technologies because and not studying the local context, the local practices, identifying the local vulnerabilities, the vulnerabilities that led, and then finding solutions that specifically address the local vulnerabilities, and instead introducing a new technology comes with incredible risk. The unintended consequences of introducing new technologies, for one. It also prevents from addressing the local vulnerabilities that will then also further, will always continue to build on itself. How does that also transfer to informal settlements? The bad apple theory, for example, there are key drivers in every community. Through science, through studies, through engineering, we can identify those. However, we do need multidimensional solutions. We do need a very, very strong cultural lens when we design disaster risk reduction and recovery programs. Those are just some of the few, I know we're running out of time, some of the very, very many lessons that we can reap from the Afghanistan case study. And I thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sabine. Next, we will turn to Mahfira Abida, Coordinator of Partnership at U Inspire Indonesia, and holder of a Master's in Earthquake Engineering with Disaster Management from University College London. Mahfira will introduce her perspective on deep learning for risk assessment, focusing on government policies, financing for disaster risk reduction, and the empowerment of women and youth as an emphasis on the Indonesia case. Mahfira, over to you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Makfira Abida, representing You Inspire Indonesia. It is youth and young professional. It was established in 2018, where the major tsunami happened in Indonesia, and it is supported by the primary advocacy from UNESCO Jakarta office. So here I would like to share the government and also society, how they shift from surviving to thriving about the strategy, especially from youth perspective. Okay, so Indonesia, like it is one of the countries with very high disaster prone area. So actually disaster event increasingly yearly in my country, both from hydrometeorological and geological hazard, and also it worsened by the geographical vulnerability and also social vulnerability, where there are so many people living in a below poverty, and also the high number of disability as well. So considering this issue, our government in Indonesia actually already have a lot of milestone in key policies and also initiative, especially since the Indian Ocean tsunami happened in 2004. We have a lot of regulation, especially covering about infrastructure, education, urban planning plan, and also about communication. And one of the most important things is about financial regulation. And there are so many initiatives we have been working on, and also and talking more about the financial and the financial regulation. Actually, we have been losses so many economic losses, and here the government already allocated some of funding. It is actually a bit fluctuated, but we can see in 2018 and 2019 that there are a huge gap between the allocation and also realization because of the major disaster impact here in Sunda Strait tsunami event, and also in Palu earthquake and tsunami event as well. So we realized that, and considering about this disaster funding as well, whether it's only covering half of the risk, so government realized that they should addressing about this issue. So there are a lot of some initiative related to the funding regulation, like the on-call funding, we say, and nowadays we addressing about disaster pooling funding, which is aimed to investing and to raising the fund, and also sharing the risk through the insurance. So, and also this funding will support many proposals from the government in subnational level, and also other ministerial under the Minister of Finance coordination. So here we talk about Indonesia. This is the largest archipelago country in the world with an extensive coastline. So it is quite crucial to consider about the coastal vulnerability in Indonesia, especially we experienced a lot of large tsunami event. And the recent one is Palu earthquake and tsunami event, where there are so many human and economic losses happen, and also damage infrastructure as well. So it is quite interesting, because one of the most important reasons why we experience significant losses because of the settlement. So actually, like people in Palu, indigenous people in Palu named Kelly, they have long understood about the risk in earthquake, tsunami, even liquefaction. They have a lot of terminology and a lot of local wisdom and beliefs to avoid settle down in the high-risk area. But in 1980s, actually, government have a program about trans-migrant program, where many migrants came and settled in a coastal and also river area. So here, that's why it is a bit contradictory, because our ancestors, we believe they have they have a kind of local wisdom to survive and to be more resilient, but then the government, local government, have a lack of regulation to control the urban development there. And also, it's not only happened in Palu actually, or in Aceh, which is very famous with the vulnerability, but there are so many regions in Indonesia have a very high vulnerability. So, but it was unfamiliar to youth actually. That's why in 2018, by the primary support and also advocacy from UNESCO Jakarta office, You Inspire Indonesia was established. And after 6 years, we already have a lot of members across the country. And also, surprisingly, we are dominated by women. And then after 6 years as well, You Inspire Indonesia has initiated You Inspire Alliance. We encourage other youth in almost 14 countries to uniting, to sharing, and to have a good environment to also take an effort and actively participated in DRR effort. And also we are committing to implement the Sendai framework for disaster. And considering, as I mentioned before, considering about the coastal vulnerability, actually we have been working in some project, especially we are working with a high technology driven for the disaster, and we call it outsmarting disaster and also coastal science. Mostly we are using kind of sensor in local area, so we try to encourage society there to manage and govern as well the data collected. So, and also we are also involving in rapid response as well. We analyze some of rapid data from the drone, and not only about the technology, we are also get involved in society preparedness. We are doing assistance in tsunami relief village. It is also one of the UNESCO program in Indonesia. So we also committed to encourage inclusive DRR and also climate resilience effort by having some of program and also having a kind of boot camp to innovate what kind of disaster resilient effort for disability and also for elderly. And also we introduced climate adaptive farming in a woman farmer in the village area to reduce the risk about climate change. And this is our future project actually. It is still work in progress. We try to develop kind of disaster edu town. It is kind of gamification. It will be very related to youth actually, and it will using agent-based modeling to be more understanding about people behavior, how they will respond when tsunami happens. So the AI will create an agent there. So we also committed to raising disaster resilience here by developing a chatbot. So what is the benefit having this? Because they will provide very specific and detailed data in our localized area. So, okay, that's all I think, and we are very open to collaborating more about our project and support more our initiative and program to implement our piloting project in Indonesia for broader implementation. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Finally, Soichiro Sayukawa, Chief of the UNESCO Disaster Risk Reduction Unit, will discuss how a multi-sectoral collaboration among stakeholders and share of outcomes of a global mapping exercise on best practices can change in line in charge in line with the Sendai framework is essential for a resilient built environment. Soichiro, I now give you the floor.
Thank you very much. It's not about the conference, but in the previous photo, I saw myself when I was very young, so I'm happy to see me when I was young. No, I would like to thank all the panelists for their interventions on the built resilience, built environment resilience, because I recall what we discussed in a Sendai conference a decade ago, March 2015, because there was a session for the built resilience. It was one of the official sessions, and UNESCO and UNDRR, GFDRR co-organized the sessions. And actually, the discussion was focused on building code and also its implementation, how we encourage countries to develop building code and how to make sure people follow it. After a decade, I think we have seen, many promising progress, how we try to make people, understand people, and people understand how important it is for the building code and then also building code. But what I'm encouraged is that we have widened the framework or perspectives of looking at these issues, because some people are talking, some panelists are talking about innovation, people are talking about vernacular techniques, some people are talking about informal settlement or financing. And then I also want to recall one of the conclusions, recommendations at the sessions at the Sendai conference. Actually, at this session for the resilient built environment, I think one of the conclusions was, let's try to organize a network of experts concerning the built environment. At that moment, I think we are only focusing on the code developer and also the government who are implementing the project. But now UNESCO would like to pick up this recommendation a decade ago to try to connect the experts on built environment. Because after a decade, I think we are more inclusive to discuss about these issues. Of course, we need engineering, we need science, we need a policy building code, and also the implementation of the building code. But I think it's more than that, because if we want to tackle the issues on the informal settlement, we also need not only the science, but also the social science approach, and also financing. I think the public buildings, I think the government can take care of it, but most of the building where people die is private houses or supermarket, etc. Then it's a private owned, so how we make sure to finance this project for resilient building. And also informal settlement, it is another huge challenge, which I think many of our experts try to avoid talking about this because of the gigantic issues that informal settlement has. But I think in the context of the built environment, we can mobilize experts from different disciplines to talk about these issues. And innovations. We have seen many presentations using artificial intelligence innovations. Even in session 1, we have I think back in 2015, we didn't know that innovation or artificial intelligence can do such enormous work, collecting, cleaning, and processing data. We didn't know that back in 2015, and I think they are really changing the landscape, how we prepare for disasters and also the built environment. That is why actually I have been discussing internally, and I think already some of you are in the podium or maybe online, to how to network the experts concerning the built environment. And since 2015, yes, there are several coalition networks concerning buildings. No. Mostly on the energy efficiency. I think in March there was a huge conference in Paris to establish a coalitions how to construct an energy efficiency building, which is on the context of the climate change mitigations. Talking about climate change adaptation for building resilience, we have a CDRI, which was created under the Indian presidency of the G20, but this scope of this CDRI, Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, is targeting on the lifeline infrastructures, like transportation, electricity, road, etc. But still, on this building itself, where you live, or where you do shopping, where you work, I think we are still missing a network of the experts. That is why we are working on it, and because it is still immature, so I cannot do like a launch, but I would like to share with you what we are thinking, and we are happy to have you in this coalition or network. So maybe we can go to I didn't do this. Okay. Just briefly about the UNESCO Disaster Risk Reduction Program. We have a wide mandate. No? UNESCO has a science, education, culture, social science, communication, information. So if we combine all these different disciplines, we have a very wide profile on the disaster risk reduction, and we say it like 8 thematic areas. And the third one is about the built environment. And I try. Yeah, so we have started like a scoping of the missions of this network. So first one is we need to identify which hazard we want to talk about, what we want to talk about. Maybe firstly we can talk about rapid onset hazards like earthquake, tsunami, building fires, or hurricanes, or flood, etc. And then we can expand to the slow onset climate change, but we try to look at the building itself to see how to build the safer buildings. And then, yeah, for this scope of the timeline frame, we look from the prevention to reaction to reconstruction. We try to cover, entire DRR cycles, how we can achieve the resilient infrastructure, resilient building. And then this is a scope of the buildings, because we really need to make sure that we don't duplicate what others are doing. So what we are trying to do is try to work on the houses or informal settlement, or like a building where anonymous people use, like shopping centers, hospitals, etc. And because, as I mentioned, the CDRI, Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, is working on the lifelines. So we are really targeting on the building where people live or use. No? And so, yeah, of course, we try to expand the scope like a territorial planning, urban planning, but we want to start small to look at the buildings. And then I think stakeholder engagement is really important, because back in 2015, we only targeted like a building code developer or government, who make a building code, who implement a building code. But we want to expand. We want to expand the discussions. We want to expand the framework with discussions. Of course, we need a government, but we need private sectors. Because as I mentioned, most of the buildings which we are using are privately owned. So we really need to encourage building owners to invest a little bit more for the safer buildings. And also, of course, a financial sector. Because I think it's a financial sector who make a credit, who loan the project, the buildings. So we need a financial sector as well. What is the financial tools? Only the loans or bonds, etc., etc. And also NGO, NPO, who are working on the ground, who really are working on the ground talking to the communities, like Sabine's presentations, we really need to understand what people need on the ground. And yes, and also relevant coalitions, as I mentioned, CDRI, etc. So, and I forgot what yeah. So yeah, so these are our initial discussions internally and with some of you for the scoping, and eventually we want to officially create networks on the built environment. We actually have some names in our mind, but we don't. I don't mention it here. But basically, these are things what we want to do in the network. Of course, we need to do a knowledge creation, knowledge sharing, and also try to encourage north-south, south-south, north-north collaborations, or like advising on the countries, etc. But this is still preliminary discussions among some of you, but I'm really happy to have your comments, or if you are interested in, we are happy to have you in the network in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you all panelists, and now we are open to questions in the room or online. Yes.
Okay. So my question is for Mrs. Cast. I was wondering how reconstruction is going in Afghanistan so far. I'm working on reconstruction in Morocco right now, post-earthquake. I was also wondering how regulation and how insurance were working there, and did you find any resistance for people in non-vernacular construction? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There was a effort right after the case study, the experience for donors and partners to invest in developing vernacular housing guidelines that were specific to various different communities. Afghanistan, like many countries, is made of a very diverse population, and there are vastly different construction practices, building practices, vernacular, and there was a real movement to study these practices and develop construction guidelines, housing guidelines, that would form part of code for the construction of these practices. Those efforts have not moved forward just yet, but Morocco provides an incredible opportunity to really focus on vernacular construction and the integration thereof. And one thing that we definitely do need to look at is mixed construction. We do see, modern construction materials like concrete and other materials being used side by side within sort of the same housing unit with vernacular, and how the two interact with each other. And develop guidelines and trainings around that. We were also engaged in the Morocco earthquake just thereafter, and supported in sort of developing vernacular repair guidelines which are used. But I think Morocco provides a unique opportunity to really promote vernacular practices and safe vernacular construction practices. Thank you for your question.
Please, Pakistan.
Thank you very much. It's a great presentations all over. I just would like to have a few of the perspectives on two key areas. One's most of these disasters, when they hit the infrastructures of the struggling economies, or especially the people in the conflict zones, then the choice after the disaster is over for the strategic planners is either to have structures with more in number and probably lesser in resilience, or have smaller number of structures with desirable resilience. So with the limited funds, often the choice goes to the first option, because people would like to build back in the same way because they don't have lots of money to invest in the resilience part of it. So how can the global financial institutions or the organizations can help us to help the regions, people who are in this infrastructure collapse after the disasters, to find out the mechanism of either having some insurance mechanisms which could be affordable by these countries, and probably some of those developing states may not be able to even afford the premium for such type of systems. So what all systems can be there for help or building that desirable resilience standards? Because if you don't invest in that resilience, similar disasters would come again and again, and then we have to, I think, repeat this cycle once over. Secondly, with regards to the choices, as you presented the case in Afghanistan, we understand that people who are living in those areas, they would love to build back in the same environment as they were living before the disaster. So often the infrastructure assistance which comes from abroad in the form of some temporary settlements or houses which are fabricated and often the smaller sizes than their actual household, so they're not affordable or acceptable in the local culture. So how big is this factor in while you calculate for the resilience in infrastructure, while you are planning like infrastructure financing and incentivizing the global mobilization of the funds for these? Thank you.
I'm so sorry, but I think the sound was bad. That's why I was telling you to get, and we didn't catch very well if it was a question. Oh, you were just making
partly
your
the question,
point.
because I guess, is there any mechanism for where the global organizations or the global finance systems can support resilience in the infrastructure? Because most of the countries, they cannot afford investing in the resilience part of it because they are more interested in building the numbers again, number one. And second, if you want, is there any insurance mechanism for these areas which are repeatedly undergoing the disasters? And if the insurance is not viable, what could be the other alternative, like global premium which can be afforded to these countries who are affected by these disasters over and over again? Thank you.
Is this working? Can you hear me? Yes. So I will attempt an answer to that. In terms of what, I will try to answer first the insurance question. So for instance, the World Bank and the insurance industry in general, they are highly promoting people taking up insurance in several number of countries. The issue is always whether the private are able to afford that insurance, or whether at the level of the infrastructure, the government of that particular country is able to afford that level of insurance. And of course, the premiums, as you are mentioning, are quite an important issue. So for instance, in many countries, now the global industry is thinking about parametric insurance, ways in which a premium are given up in expectation of a certain level of damage rather than and in immediate time, so that the recovery is much speedier rather than that with a very long-term process, and that the level of premium doesn't increase after an event. So I think that was part of your questions. The other part was about mechanism for international institutions to support reconstructions after event at the level of the countries. Again, we know what is the process of donors coming together. We have seen, for instance, this for Turkey, but also for Pakistan in the past years. And the issue is, again, whether the international banks ultimately or the refinancing institutions are in a position to support those reconstruction, and what then that means down the line for the public debit of the country, how that can be written off or how that can be, and it's more a political issue than not a financial issue.
I'll jump in as well. I don't have an answer, but just to build on to the question that you posed, the sort of quantity versus quality. And I think it has to do with trade-offs. There are always these trade-offs that are really difficult to balance. There's one between speed and deliberation, and there is another between sort of quantity and quality. And the only sort of answer perhaps there is to it is to be very aware of the trade-offs that you make, And in that sense, the studying the data is really important so that we understand if we are making a decision, every decision comes with a trade-off. If we are making a decision, that we are aware of the trade-offs and that there is a cost benefit that drives that.
Is there? Thank you. Thank you very much for your question. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much. Raghav Pant from the University of Oxford. I had a question for the panel in terms of the talk that Dina gave, Anna and Sabine. So one of the things about it's about the interface between a global interface like Glossy that you're developing that tries to generalize building typologies and fragilities and everything. And then from Sabine's talk, we so almost there's a cultural element to that as well, in the sense of like the interpretation of what a building means for people in Afghanistan, and which produces the counterintuitive example that a vernacular is better than the I might have messed it up anyway. But so do you think there's a scope for kind of this integration of as we are trying to also generalize and build global data sets and kind of improve our understanding of all of these kind of building vulnerabilities, fragilities, we need to integrate not just kind of the generalized data, but also cultural, social norms in all of this. And how do you think that we do that as we move forward? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your questions. Well, as I tried to highlight in my presentation, each country will develop its own, if we are looking at school, in its own way, and so on. There will be program of construction for education as the education market and the taking up of education takes up in the development of countries. But let's say our I want to call it engineering understanding, but our technical understanding, whether it's engineering as we consider it or whether we call it vernacular, even the vernacular construction is still engineered in the mind of or who builds it, because it's solving a problem. Therefore, there is a reproducible process, and there are solutions that, if properly understood and interpreted, they can then be standardized. And once they are standardized, we have enough tools to understand their behavior, their response to hazards, which again are standards, i.e. an earthquake is an earthquake is an earthquake in any part of the world with slightly different characteristics, but the end results on the building is still the same. And therefore, on the basis of that, we can then generalize the problem at the global level and understand what are the needs at the global level, because ultimately organizations like the UNDRR or the UNESCO or the international and intercontinental lending banks have to think about how do we better the planet and how do we better the planet where, yes? And therefore they need to have that global ranking and ideas that we can then use as a reference.
Well, may I say that in my country, we have high poverty, and part of the building is that most of the constructions are informal. So when you have a lot of informal construction, you don't follow rules. And as I showed, we have a very robust in laws, in terms, but it's difficult to make him follow it. So UNESCO, with this project with Verlac, is trying to give us what we have to do, what the government has to do to build better. So I don't know if that's okay.
Yeah, excellent question. global standards, global models. I do believe that there is global best practices and there are universal lessons. For example, when we develop the evaluation framework or just quantifying the success of recovery, there is no universal model that exists. And primarily also because it is so hard to quantify. And a lot of this is so hard to quantify. However, when we sifted through all these dozens of disaster reconstruction programs for the last 40, 50 years across the globe, we did find that there are, factors that do drive successful recovery. And being able to identify those that have global application and codify those can really then lead to good sort of guidelines to utilize. These models have to have the adaptability to then not become blueprints, because it's difficult to have blueprints that then sort of wash over local context, which as we see, if the site-specific, locally appropriate specific factors are not incorporated, you will have a misguided program, and your investments will likely also cease.
Thank you. Another question, because we are running out of time for the next session, and I'm sad that the online questions cannot be answered. So thank you very much to all the panelists. I hope the ideas that was shared today will inspire the new approaches and partnerships as we continue towards a more resilient future for all. Thank you once again to our panelists, to all of you to engage in this important conversation. We invite you for the next session. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, experts, colleagues, online attendees, good afternoon. My name is Irina Pavlova. I'm from UNESCO's Natural Sciences sector. So after all these reflections in previous sessions on technologies, innovations, and built environment, so in this session we'll continue to understand the value of culture, nature, and indigenous traditions in the way how to strengthen and build resilience. So without further ado, I would like to invite our 5 distinguished panelists to join me on the stage, please. So these 5 distinguished guests are Rohit Jasu, Program Manager, International Center of the Study on Prevention and Restoration on Cultural Property, Michelle Miku, Professor, University of West Indies, Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Nusante San, Deputy Director of Royal Antiquity Museum in Vietnam, Serge Snresh, Deputy Head of Climate and Natural Division, French Agency of Development, and last not least, Antonio de Souza Abreu, Director of Division Ecological and Earth Sciences of UNESCO. So if the panel is ready, we will start the discussion, and I hope that during this session we will explore together what are the interlinkages of nature, culture, nature-based solutions, indigenous people systems, and how this contribute to in the context of disaster risk reduction. So we would like first, as in previous sessions, we will first like to hear from you, your interventions, and then we'll continue in a more interactive way to exchange with question and answers in presence and online. So to start and open the discussion, I would like to invite Mr. Rohit to elaborate on what's the importance of these interlinkages between nature, culture, nature-based solutions, and indigenous peoples. Please.
Thank you very Thank you very much. First of all, thank you, UNESCO, for inviting me over here. So I just titled this Moving Beyond Sendai Framework, Culture and Nature for Building Resilience. And I remember when we were speaking about, when we were working on Sendai Framework discussions, there was for the first time a consideration for cultural assets. But then they were all considered as cultural assets in isolation or as cultural heritage. But what we see increasingly is that when we encounter heritage sites being affected by disasters such as this huge flood, which impacted this very important World Heritage Site, we know the actual reason is not just the rainfall or the climate risk, but actually the real reason is what's happening in the surroundings of those sites. The urban development has actually, which is unregulated, this has created loss of landscapes, and actually it has also affected the watershed areas. The water systems have been disrupted, and because of that, when you have enough rainfall, there is not enough way of disposing of this surplus water. So what does that imply? It implies that we need to address risk transfer at multiple levels, from local to regional and vice versa, and that implies that there has to be a territorial planning perspective. So if we are looking at cities or peri-urban areas or rural areas, we cannot look at them in isolation. What we have to see is how these are interconnected with each other, and if we look at cultural heritage, we cannot understand cultural heritage without having a understanding of how it links to the natural setting in which it is located. So we need to actually learn new tools and methodologies on how to deal with this new way of thinking. For long we have looked at whether a monastery or a sacred mountain or an industrial heritage or a historic building or a marine ecosystem separately, but what we are really looking for is a heritage place-based approach, which is about looking at the totality of the system, within which culture is an element and so is the nature. And so we have to consider these systems that are interconnected to each other. This also implies that we have to start re-looking at how we consider heritage sites management, because we have been for long delineating a boundary and considering that as a heritage site and making a DRM plan or disaster risk management plan for that site, without understanding that actually a lot of risks are concentrated in the setting or the surroundings. So we can't really deal with disaster risk without understanding what's happening in the larger context, whether it is natural or social context. So I also want to bring in another issue, which is that for centuries, for generations, culture has always evolved in very close proximity to the natural setting. So whether we look into this water village of Kampong Ayer in Brunei Darussalam, we understand that these have actually evolved because of the understanding of the local ecosystem. And they have also very systematically considered mangroves that have actually ensured that these have survived even with lots of flood risks and issues which are nature related. So there have been this very sensitive understanding of natural setting, and traditional knowledge has actually resulted in these settlements as they are today. We also have to then change our approach, because for long we have looked at heritage, whether natural or cultural, as weak or vulnerable, something that we just need to protect or preserve. But we have to actually understand that there are a lot of lessons embedded in sustainable design, planning, and management, and these have to be understood. The distinct ecological relationships have to be really rediscovered and have to provide us solutions for the future development trajectory. Sorry, I need to go back. So, in fact, we were very happy that we could collaborate with UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction on precisely this topic for this Words into Action guide for Sendai framework, looking at traditional knowledge for disaster risk reduction. Actually, the whole guide was focused on not just understanding what the knowledge is, but how to use the knowledge, because we cannot just continue to create, rediscover this knowledge and create a lot of research. We have to also understand how this knowledge can be used in today's context. We came up with 2 months ago, we came up with this repository of case studies with traditional knowledge, and not just about how the knowledge is there, but how knowledge has been actually used in today's context. So there's a need to promote innovation by linking traditional and indigenous knowledge with scientific knowledge. We really believe that for long we have tried to romanticize about traditional indigenous knowledge, trying to just see this is very great, we have to just preserve it because it comes from our past. It gives us identity. Yes, there might be those important lessons, but sometimes this knowledge is also outdated. What is really important is to bring the two knowledge systems together. There are scientific aspects which are embedded in traditional and indigenous knowledge, and there are also traditional ways of communicating, traditional ways of communicating the knowledge. On the other hand, we also need to know how we can use traditional communication systems to actually communicate the traditional knowledge, scientific knowledge to local communities. So it is very important for us to recognize culture and natural heritage as a source of resilience and developing innovative solutions that aim at adapting and utilizing traditional management systems. So I really want to emphasize that we have to move from just knowing what is traditional knowledge to how to use the traditional knowledge in today's context. And that really requires us to link between research and practice. That also means that we have to think about ecosystem-based adaptation tools. There's a lot of work being done, and while we use these traditional systems that have been developed over generations, we also need to embed them in seeing how they can be applied in today for developing various tools that can help us to devise these adaptation solutions. For World Heritage, specifically, we have actually been looking at rethinking about disaster risk management for World Heritage properties, where we are not considering nature and cultural sites separately, but actually for each cultural World Heritage site, there are natural solutions. And for each natural World Heritage site, there are cultural solutions. So it is very important that we start to see this cross-connection where nature and culture interact at various levels. For long, heritage conservation and management has worked kind of in isolation, but Sendai framework actually has been a very, I would say, a benchmark where heritage actually started to figure in international disaster management policy discourse. But that is not enough. As we have seen from various examples since the beginning, it is very important that we bring together disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, sustainable development goals together with heritage conservation and management practices, which implies that these have to be both adaptation and mitigation strategies have to be embedded in heritage conservation and management procedures. And at the same time, heritage should be included in climate change and disaster policies. Somehow they don't figure in each other's policies. And what is important is that they're embedded in each other's policies. I'm just coming towards the last part of my presentation, where I want to really emphasize strengthening cross-sectoral collaboration for efficient DRR governance for cultural and natural heritage. It means that we need to have data or information sharing and communication between disaster risk management and cultural and natural heritage agencies. There's still a lot of gap. The agencies don't talk to each other. So how are we going to achieve what we want to achieve if this governance issue is not resolved? We also need to develop common definitions, protocols, and standard formats for collecting and storing disaster loss data on cultural and natural heritage at the national level through involvement of statistical agencies and other relevant organizations. Also, development of quantitative and qualitative tools for risk assessment of cultural and natural heritage sites and museums is really necessary. And lastly, making risk information available in understandable and usable format to the managers of cultural and natural heritage sites and museums for improved decision making is also very necessary. So I would just close by emphasizing something that actually Sendai's framework really helped in a big way, but there's a lot more needs to be done, that the two sides which are somehow in their own shells have to start to even work further towards closer collaboration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rohit. Wonderful kickoff of the discussion to highlight that, of course, heritage has a dual role, and we should not only protect it, as it's stated in the Sendai, but also put it further into more, highlight the further active role of heritage and being in the heart of territorial development and introducing elements of nature, culture, heritage into disaster risk reduction plans. So to continue the discussion, I'd like to ask Michelle to dive into more specific territorial and cultural context. And yes, please. And tell us, well, you are the leading author of the chapter related to small islands in the IPCC's sixth report. And we would like you to tell a bit more your insights about the local, national, DRR and climate change adaptation strategies in SEEDS. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to UNESCO for the invitation to present. And I hope to infuse with you some of the key experiences within the small island developing states in the Caribbean context. So, first of all, within the Caribbean and many parts of the Pacific Islands, indigenous knowledge and local knowledge do exist, but the importance is how do we get to integrating that knowledge into policy and practice. When we consider that ancestral knowledge of indigenous peoples has existed for a long time, and it's in a sense an intergenerational wealth in that there is wisdom about how the planet functions. Every aspect of the planet in terms of understanding how the stars work, the tides rise, how the soils function, how rain comes, how trees grow, that is all part of indigenous knowledge that has been around for centuries. And in every part of the world, it's not exclusive to any one part of the world. So we do know that when we consider amongst the small island developing states, there are diverse cultures with layers of indigenous civilizations and knowledge embedded in those cultures. What we need to respond to is the fact that climate change is placing pressure on us to find solutions. And we need to use, therefore, our cultural as well as our natural resources to respond to some of these challenges. In a way, we need to revisit some of the homegrown solutions that we've used before in trying to solve the problems that we face. Some of the researchers working in the field have said that despite our increasing recognition of indigenous and local knowledge, most of that knowledge remains really on the margins or the periphery of some of our national adaptation plans, and that insufficient attention is being paid to the actual insights with regards to how we deal with extreme events and other impacts of climate change. In fact, some of the scientific initiatives have tried to or have been mobilized to include indigenous knowledge, but not always in a collaborative way. There is need to bring these forms of indigenous knowledge to the table as equal partners with policymakers and amongst the scientific community within the academies and other research institutions. Of course, how we need to function in terms of good practice is to not keep the two knowledge systems apart, but try to integrate those knowledge systems. There is much to be gained from cross-fertilization of ideas from indigenous peoples, as well as new scientific knowledge emerging from the climate modeling scientists and the climate change specialists and so on. However, that new knowledge is being distilled, but it's not being distilled in a at a fast enough pace to reach the indigenous people as well as the local community. Someone spoke about building capacity at the local or subnational levels. Field experience is suggesting that we have a mutual respect for the indigenous knowledge as well as the scientific knowledge and an understanding of how the disasters and climate change really work and impact on our communities. To do that, though, to build mutual respect, we have to build trust, and that takes a lot of time. As a researcher myself, I can tell you that building trust is not that easy, and it means being in the field, going back to your communities on a constant basis. You can't parachute into a community and then leave the community and expect to build trust and respect. That mutual respect has to be developed over time. There are projects occurring throughout the Pacific Islands and the Caribbean where there is an attempt to engage stakeholder communities. And so, for example, I'm aware of a coastal resilience project which is being implemented as I speak within Trinidad in the Caribbean, where they're embracing new technologies, using drone technology and participatory geographic information systems to work with people on the ground and the indigenous communities, as well as policymakers, to better understand how to prepare for the disasters and other extreme events